Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. Thank you so much for joining us today for Minnesota Matters, where we talk about issues in Minnesota that impact banking. My name is Tess Rice. I'm MBA's General Counsel. I'm joined by Teresa Kuvas, MBA's Senior Government Relations Manager. Today, we're focusing on the state legislative session. Hopefully, most of you know that MBA is very active at the state capitol. Teresa works full-time at the Capitol during session. I mean, not this year because she's been Zooming full-time, but we do have a team of contract lobbyists that's also there that help us as well. If you have any questions for us today, please put them in the chat. I'm going to go turn it over to Teresa now to talk about the session generally, and then we'll take a closer look at some of the different pieces of legislation that could impact your bank. Teresa?
Sounds great. Thank you, everybody, and good morning. I've been with the MBA now for 18 years. I've been around the Capitol for 20 years. So just to I wanted to go through where we are at right now. How did we get here and where are we going from here, and just look at what has been happening the last couple of months in St. Paul. So most people aren't in St. Paul, but the session began on January 5th of 2021, and constitutionally they have to be done by this past Monday, which was May 17th. So however, as you may have seen, either between my political insight or the news, they once again did not reach a budget agreement, and they didn't pass all of the budget bills that they needed to get done. If you asked me last year after the election, if there was going to be a special session to work on budget items, I would have said 100% yes. Just to give a little bit of background, the legislature hasn't been away from the Capitol for more than 30 days for the last year, 14 months. When they went into session in February of 2020, they started, normal 2020 things. And then they, with the peacetime emergency in March of 2020, they shut down the Capitol. But in order for the governor to extend his peacetime emergencies, he must have the legislature back in session. So every 30 days, between May of last year when they adjourned to January when they came back in, he had to call them in every 30 days. If you may recall, over those special sessions for the last year, they did pass a couple of things. They passed tax bill, they passed a bonding bill. The Republicans, took up some confirmations in the Senate. But for the most part, they were back all of last year. So they haven't had a break. But that also shows that they knew that in order for Governor Walz to once again push out his peacetime emergency, they will be called back on June 14th. So they knew that one session ended on May 17th, that they would be back in June regardless. The Constitution is the one that determines when session ends. It is, the session must end the first Monday after the third Saturday in May. And that's just how the Constitution has been written. But technically that deadline really isn't until June 30th when the fiscal year ends and we bump up against that possible government shutdown. So that government shutdown is truly the deadline that the legislature must meet. What we have found over the years is that the constitutional deadline has become more of a budget target deadline. So if you can, they've always worked that last session to really try and figure out the numbers. They'd like to do it earlier in May, but truly it seems to be around that constitutional deadline that they do find that agreement on numbers. So that is what happened once again this week. On Monday morning, we heard that they had an agreement on numbers, and that they have set now deadlines across, they've set one for next Friday, May 28th, to have their spreadsheets done, and then June 4th to have language done, and then to come back in on June 14th in hopes of having a one-day session to pass all the budget bills and get out. Will that happen? Again, we still have 2 weeks after that until they really have to be done. So once the governor calls them into a legislative special session, he can only call them in. He cannot tell them when they're done. So they can be in as long as they want. But again, with the House and Senate being different, one will oftentimes adjourn before the other one does. Are special sessions normal? They have become normal. Obviously last year was different where we were meeting every month for the pandemic. But in the last 10 years, in the last 6 now budgets, 5 of the 6 have come to a special session in order to finish up the work that the legislature must finish up. Why is that the case? Prior to 2011, they seem to be, they seem to have more routine of getting things done on time. 2013 was the only time in the last 10 years that they did get the budget done on time, but that was when there was one party control at the Capitol. That was when the DFL held the House, Senate, and the governor's office. So they were all on the same page to get things done on time. Since that time, we've had split government. That gets to kind of how are we where we are right now. Minnesota is the only state in the country that has the split legislature. Most have, House and Senate, one party. We have a split, we have the Republican Senate and the Democrat House, and that's the way that, and people will say, why does Minnesota like divided government? I don't truly believe that Minnesotans like divided government. We are just a state that has different mindsets and different philosophies and kind of voting blocks throughout the state. So if you look at greater Minnesota, that is where the Republicans hold a lot of those seats. So in that greater Minnesota area, you have Republicans holding most of those seats. The, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and that first ring of suburbs, the Democrats really do have control over those seats. And then there's some of the other suburban seats that seem to flip depending on the year. Obviously, the last 2 years, the Metro has not done well for Republicans based off of Trump being the president and being up for election and people just kind of voting against Trump in the Metro area. So that's kind of how we've kind of gotten to where we are. I think most of us believed in 2020 that the entire legislature would go DFL, that we would have a one-party control again. That's not the case. The House, which was 75-59 going into the election in 2020, they lost a couple of seats. So after the election, they are now at a 70-64 majority. The Senate Republicans had a 35-32 going into the November elections, and they ended up with a 34-33 majority. Now there's some internal politics in both the House and Senate. We have in the House, we have a new Republican caucus within the Republican group. So there's 4 or 5 of them that have split off to a new Republican caucus. And then you also within the DFL, you have the BIPOC, the people of color and indigenous group caucus that also has a voting block. So in the House, you have these different dynamics, which make a challenge within the Republican group and also in the DFL side, in the DFL majority, as to how do you get things through, because you have one group that if you have a majority, but you have this posse caucus, which is the people of color and indigenous, that want certain things to be done. So they have to all work together within those caucuses. But then if you look at the Senate, which was, after the election, they went from a 35-32 to a 34-33. But then you had Senators Bach and Thomasoni decide to break away from the DFL caucus and caucus on their own as independents, but actually truly caucus with the Republicans. They were both given committee chair positions. So they oftentimes tend to vote with the Republicans. So now you have a 36-31 vote for the Republicans. All that being said, there's no wonder that you can't get to an agreement by the constitutional deadline. There's so many different personalities at the Capitol. The Republicans really came in this session wanting, PPP tax conformity. They wanted to get the economy. They wanted business back open and running. They wanted the peacetime emergencies to end. So they were really focused on, if we want to get a budget, there are a couple of things that we need to happen. And then you had the DFL that wanted police reform. They want to deal with, they want to do the racial equity. How do we get more diversity? They wanted to look at education. So you have a lot of policy ideas in the House, and then you have a lot, so you have, again, very different mentalities to all come together in 201 legislators to figure out an agreement. So in the end, you really look at Speaker Hortman, Governor Walz, and Senate Majority Leader Gazelka really coming to that agreement. So their agreement was solely based on numbers. And I'll get a little bit more into the agreements as we go through some of the outstanding issues. But this year really was supposed to be a budget year. We came into the session with a $1.2 billion deficit. With the influx of money from Congress and from DC, we ended up really flipping that around to a $1.6 billion surplus, and it's just gotten better month after month. So how they were really trying to look at things, things became easier. Tax increases didn't need to happen. PPP conformity should happen. So a lot of that stuff still needs to be worked out. But again, the agreement that was determined by the governor and the majority leader and the speaker was based solely off of numbers. That being said, there is a lot of policy that is really coming out when it comes to the police reform, when it comes to a lot of education, when it comes to clean energy. There's a lot of policy items on the table, but the governor and the speaker and the majority leader have said that that stuff needs to be dealt with within the conference committees, which are now working groups because they are outside of session. So there's a lot of policy stuff, but if they can't come to agreement with that stuff, the policy stuff has to go away. So right now, they are trying to work on those numbers. I'm going to pass it over to Tess to kind of talk about some of the stuff that actually did happen this session. And then we'll go into some of the stuff that will be coming up in the next month that's still outstanding. So I will hand it over to Tess for a couple of the things that did pass this year.
Thanks, Teresa. A bill that we spent a ton of time on has to do with Minnesota's checking account statute 48512. This bill passed the House and Senate unanimously this session. It's still waiting for the governor's signature. It sounds like it hasn't made it to the governor quite yet, but we do expect him to sign that. So it modifies 48.512. So this law came around in 1983. The realtors were tired of getting bad checks from customers. And so they got this law passed that applies to transaction accounts that are owned by natural persons and requires banks to check to see if an applicant for an account has had an account closed involuntarily in the past 12 months at another bank. And so that's why a lot of banks use check systems. I mean, it's a smart thing to do anyway, but that's one of the reasons they do it. And if they do appear on check systems, then the bank can't open the account. That statute was preempted by the OCC, so national banks haven't had to follow it, though we have heard from national banks that they do choose to follow it anyway. On the other hand, we've heard from bankers that want the flexibility to open accounts for people, especially to help the unbanked and underbanked. So we kind of had bankers on both sides of this issue. So we decided we would have an idea of what we wanted to do if someone wanted to change the statute, because it's been talked about over the sessions many times by different groups. So this session, it turned out the credit union network wanted to just remove that entire provision about not opening accounts for these people. And so we took the opportunity then to shape that bill, knowing that something was likely to pass. So we drafted language that would allow a financial institution to ignore that part of the statute if they're offering accounts as part of a program to help the unbanked and underbanked. So we thought, okay, this is the best of both worlds. We can help out those banks that want to offer these programs, but for those banks who don't, they can still rely on this statute when turning down accounts. They can say, sorry, we'd like to help you, but we can't because of state law. So we're pretty happy about that, how that turned out. We also looked at there's a fee limitation in there. It's the only one. It's on returned deposits, and it restricts the fee to $4. So this is back in 1983. National banks can charge whatever they think is appropriate, right? So they're charging triple or more of that, but state banks can't. So we asked for that to be removed as part of our agreement to work on the statute. We did see some legislatures balk at that. And so what we compromised on is increasing the fee to $10. And that kind of approximates inflation since 1983. So that's the language that's in the bill that should be presented to the governor soon. And so then it would be effective August 1st, 2021. So you could start charging that fee once you've disclosed it to your customers on August 1st. So we're very happy how that turned out. If you have any questions about that, just let us know. The other statute I wanted to mention, because not a lot really passed specifically for banks, has to deal with reverse mortgages. I just want to let you know about it. I know most of you don't offer these, but this was signed into law by the governor already, and it's effective August 1st as well. So it applies to reverse mortgage loans that are originated on or after August 1st. And it just requires lenders and servicers of a reverse mortgage loan to notify borrowers that they can identify an additional person to receive communications regarding loan defaults. So this gets at the issue where you have an elderly person with a reverse mortgage and they're behind on their probably taxes or insurance, and they go into foreclosure. This would allow like a third person that's probably a family member or a close friend to get a notice from the servicer as well, so that they could prevent that house from going into foreclosure. And finally, there was a statute, or there's a bill, Senate File 440, has to do with foreclosure of tax forfeited property. So when someone's home is foreclosed due to tax debt, it expands the current law protections that are in there for foreclosures to these tax forfeited properties, common interest communities, and contracts for deed. And it also makes some changes to the process for issuing and recording a state deed for tax forfeited property. So just wanted to make you aware of that as well. I'm going to stop with those three and turn it back over to Teresa.
Sounds great. The one that I want to talk about before we got to outstanding issues was farmer lender mediation. This one obviously has been on the books for 35 years. Last year when COVID, the pandemic hit, and everybody was trying to figure out what do we do for homeowners, what do we do for, everyone. Farmers were obviously brought into the picture as well. And that was when the legislature looked at extending farmer lender mediation, the timeline process, 60 days. And that was set to expire at the beginning of December. So we didn't know, we didn't pose it back in April, May, when they originally were talking about it. We didn't know what the ag economy was going to look like this year. We didn't know what the pandemic was going to hold. So we really didn't feel that was the time to really kind of speak up and say, is this actually necessary? So we didn't say anything back when that got extended, but we did talk to the Senate chairs at that time, and I actually talked to the Commissioner of Ag as well. And so we kind of walked through things back then. In December, when the December special session was coming back in, they started talking about whether to extend it again. And I spoke with the Commissioner of Ag back then, and I think a lot of you would find this kind of funny, which was his comment was, I think if we extend the timeline, if we extended it a little bit more, this will be the last time that they extend it. And I had to giggle because that's obviously the point of farmer lender mediation, is that we keep extending it every so many years, and it will never go away. So I kind of laughed at that the belief was that we would extend it one more time and that that would be enough for the pandemic. I just didn't think that it was ever going to be enough. So they didn't end up doing it in December. We talked to them. We said, at this point, things have gotten a lot better for the ag economy. The PPP loans were starting to come in, that farmers were starting to qualify more for the PPP loans. We didn't think that it was necessary to extend the timeline any longer due to the pandemic. And so they didn't in December. January, when session came back in, Representative Lippert from the Northfield area introduced a bill, and his bill was extending the timeline during the pandemic. And we spoke with him. We had bankers from the district, and we had some from the executive, from the MBA executive committee, speak with him kind of about it. But his comment was, if we can save one farmer, then we really should, extend this out. We testified at, I think, 3 hearings on farmer lender mediation this year. What ended up happening between the first time the bill came up and the second time the bill came up, the author actually changed the language. In the first hearing, and I think even in private conversations, University of Minnesota Extension's Mary Nell Preisler, she spoke to some of the legislators and said that there just wasn't enough time in the process. And not only did she say there was not enough time in the process, during COVID, she said there's just not enough time in the 90-day window of farmer lender mediation. So just off the cuff said, we need more time. What we learned when we were doing some research in December was that, the University of Minnesota wasn't allowing their people to meet in person. So right there, you had mediators unable to meet in person. And then we also found out that extensions didn't necessarily have the best technology in place. So they weren't really able to do a lot of the Zoom and conference meetings as well. So our question was, is the need for more time because you don't have the equipment, or are you just asking for more time? Because in 35 years of farmer lender mediation being on the books, in all the meetings that we've had, we've never heard that 90 days was not enough. This was the first time we had ever heard that they needed more time. And at that point, Representative Lippert chose to change his bill from a pandemic only language to a 30 days permanently. So we are going to permanently increase the timeline from 90 days to 120 days. And in the meantime, we're going to push the sunset out till 2027, even though we didn't need to do it till next year. So he really got into every meeting saying, farmers need this, extensions need this. Extensions got into these hearings and started going through like all of the reasons why they needed it. We were part of a task force back in 2016, which we actually wrote the language for. And even in an entire interim of task force meetings on farmer lender mediation, an additional 30 days was never brought up. So we kept talking about, if something needs to change, let's have another conversation about it, but let's not just do it because one person said we need to do it. The representative also kept bringing up that now loans are being sold to bigger national lenders and they just don't know the communities. And I'm not quite sure if the legislator actually meant large institutions or nationally chartered institutions, not realizing that nationally chartered banks and federally chartered credit unions are also in those communities. So we really refuted a lot of what he said, and we did a lot of work with the other stakeholders in this between ICBM and Farm Credit. We all really started talking to the conference committee because it ended up in the House Conference Committee language, but we talked to all the senators and we've talked to more of the House members. And in the end, after a lot of conversation, the language that ended up this passing on Monday in the Ag Policy Bill was only a push out of the extension. So the farmer lender mediation sunset now has gone to 2027. So being pushed out to 2027, the Senate actually thought if we push it out now, we don't have to deal with it again. I think it probably will still come up again in the future, but for now, that one has passed. So kind of looking at a couple of the things that are still on the table. And then I know that Tess has one more issue that she really wants to talk about before we get off. And I know we have about 8 minutes left. Tax bill. So the tax bill is the one that all Republicans are looking at, that everybody's really kind of focused on. And that is one that, the governor and the House Democrats wanted to put a 5th tier income bracket into. So tax increases in the agreement are gone. So that one should not come up again. The agreement did state that they would have full conformity for PPP loans and the unemployment insurance. So that should get done. Again, what I like to, as I like to say is, they have an agreement, but until it's actually been passed and seen in the language, I am always very leery as to what, will there be, and, will everything happen? I know that PPP is very important for a lot of people, so I do believe that PPP will get taken care of. So that is really what, is being focused on in that tax bill. Another couple of things in the tax bill of interest. If you've heard me talk in the last couple of years, we've talked a lot about property assessed clean energy. We worked on a bill a couple of years ago that really put consumer protections on the ability for residential PACE. There was actually language that was slipped into a bill that would allow local governments, it would actually allow residents and businesses to petition their city for a special assessment for clean energy programs. We knew that there was already a program in place, but what we found is that the city that wanted it didn't want to actually do the work that was actually required in the current statute. So they thought that they could just put a line in their special assessment statute and that would be enough. Sadly for them, they actually put a citation in there that kind of raised the red flag for us. And then we really kind of worked on that one. We said, no way that you can open this up for residents. Obviously the lien position comes into place. And so we talked about all the work we had done, all the consumer protections, the lien, the ability to sell your property if you have something attached to your property, the ability to buy. We know the Fannie and Freddie don't want anything hindering a property. So we talked to the legislator, and they decided to give up the residential side of it, but they still wanted to do the commercial. And we said, okay, that's fine, but we would really appreciate that the lender knows that this is happening. When we explain to them, when we make a loan, there's a certain amount of risk that we take on with these loans, and now to eventually have a special assessment added on after the fact, that, you know, there could have been a question whether that loan would have been approved or if there would have been additional things to look at. So they did decide to put that notification to lenders in there. That was accepted into the tax conference committee report, which again hasn't been passed at all, but that language will likely end up in there. There was another definition of resident trust that was put into the house tax bill as well. This came from the Department of Revenue. You recall a couple of years ago, we worked on residency language. A lot of people that were moving to Florida were closing down their bank accounts, getting rid of their CPAs and their attorneys, because one of the requirements of if you were a Minnesota resident was where your financial institution was located. And we explained to them that, you know, with the environment we're in these days, you don't actually have to be in the same state as your bank. So that was taken care of a couple of years ago. Now there's a resident trust issue, and it looks to be that if your trust account is administered in Minnesota, even if you don't live here, like you could have one of our members that has a trust account in Minnesota, but you may live in Michigan and you may have nothing else to do with Minnesota except for the person that administers your trust is here. And that would pull you into Minnesota to actually pay the taxes here. So we have been working with the Bar Association and the CPAs and some trust groups on that. We've spoken with the Senate tax chair, and she does not want to do it. We spoke with the House tax chair, and he said that sounds like something we should work on over the interim. So we're hoping that that won't end up going anywhere as well. So that's the tax bill. The commerce bill, there's a lot in there. There's a lot of policy in there right now, and that needs to be worked out. There's, you know, payday lending regulations. There's some student loan servicer stuff. There's a lot in there. I think a lot of that gets whittled away when we end up, when they come down to the numbers. The Senate bill was only 11 pages. The House bill was, 50 some pages. So that is that bill. I'm going to pass it over to Tess because I know we're running out of time. Maybe we'll have another update when we finalize the legislative session in June. Legislative summary will come out this summer, which will have a vast amount of information in there. So pass over to you, Tess.
Thanks, Teresa. We did have a question in the chat about the checking account bill that I talked about earlier. The OCC preempted that long ago, so long that I can't even find the letter about it. But so none of those requirements should apply to national banks, though, as I mentioned, a lot of national banks do like to follow that statute, at least parts of it. There's two bills I want to mention that came up this session that could have a serious impact on banks. The first one is Senate File 2516. It was introduced on May 10th, so session ended May 17th. So it was a very late introduction. It would apply the protections of Regulation E to small businesses. It does that by adding small businesses to the definition of consumer. So a small business is defined as a business entity with less than 50 full-time employees. So that would mean that a bank would have to know how many employees its business customers had to know whether to apply all the protections of Regulation E to those business customers. I think that one's a nightmare. It also introduces a good faith standard stating that a financial institution and any person who initiated an EFT from a consumer's account has to cooperate in good faith with the consumer to establish the facts relevant to an unauthorized EFT. So obviously the legislator has a specific issue that he is wanting to get addressed, and we will work with him, show him how complicated what he wants to do is, and hopefully we can take care of this one. The other one is the Consumer Privacy Act. This bill is similar to the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, and it's modeled on the Washington Privacy Act. Now that's been in their legislature for 3 years and it has not passed. So it would apply to legal entities that conduct business in Minnesota that during a calendar year control or process the personal data of 100,000 or more Minnesota residents. I'm hoping that kicks out a lot of community banks. The bill wouldn't apply to Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act regulated personal data. It's not a great exemption. I mean, that's kind of unclear what that would mean. There is not currently a private right of action in the bill that would allow a consumer to, let's say, sue a bank directly under this statute, but the author has said that he's open to adding that. So that's a real risk as well. There is a Uniform Law Commission working on uniform privacy language because different states are looking at different languages and they want to do something uniform. So far, that language is no better than what I just told you about. So it's not something to look forward to, but we definitely do expect to see this language come up again next year. I also just wanted to mention the executive orders because we get a lot of questions on those. Those are still in effect till June 1st or June 14th, I'm sorry, at least. So we have the one that impacts garnishments and levies, saying that any future stimulus payments are protected unless they are claims for child support or spousal maintenance. Contractual set-off and security interests asserted by financial institutions are also barred on those stimulus payments. Garnishments and levies are allowed on consumer debtors for judgments entered before May 4th of 2020. And then we still have Executive Order 2079 that's prevents writs of execution. So it doesn't prohibit foreclosures, obviously. I don't think they thought they could do that because they shouldn't. But what they could prevent is the sheriff's office enforcing a writ, and that means you cannot remove someone from a foreclosed property. So I think that's all. That's going to do it for our latest episode of Minnesota Matters. If you have any questions about any of this, please reach out to me or to Teresa. Thank you so much for joining us and have a great day.